Good evening, everybody. Very glad to see this auditorium brimming with people. I'm Julia Jaquette, and I teach in the Fine Arts Department here at FIT. And I am very pleased to be introducing the first speaker in this season's round of ARTSpeak, the Fine Arts project. And I'm also very, very pleased that our first speaker is David Mazzucchelli, artist David Mazzucchelli. And by the way, we're calling this season's, that is the 2012-2013 season of ARTSpeak, Open Book, Conversations on Art and the Book. And we could have no better example of the rich relationship between the written word and the visual arts than David's work. David is going to be giving a very special talk tonight, and he's going to discuss the unique storytelling ability of comics and is also going to show his own work. David has been making comics since childhood and is now one of today's most celebrated graphic novelists and comics artists. He is a graduate of Rhode Island School of Design. He has gained renown on his collaborations on seminal Batman and Daredevil comics, such as Batman Year One, and also his adaptation of Paul Auster's City of Glass. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission Fellowship, and has had a retrospective of his work at New York's Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art in, was it 2009? 2009. His graphic novel, his wonderful graphic novel, Asterios Polyp, was a New York Times notable book for 2009, and also the winner of a Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He is also an educator and has taught at the Rhode Island School of Design and is currently teaching at the School of Visual Arts. I want to remind everybody that you can learn more about our series, ARTSpeak, and about the artists who have spoken it and are speaking in it by simply Googling ARTSpeak and FIT, and it will bring you to the ARTSpeak blog. And you are welcome to comment on what you see there and comment on what you hear here tonight and in any night that we're having a lecture. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce to you David Mazzucchelli.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, FIT, for inviting me. Hello. Good evening. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was comics. Because in the beginning, all comics were humorous or comical. Today, not all comics are funny. In fact, many of them are intentionally not funny. So you may have heard about something brand new or relatively new called the graphic novel. Unfortunately, graphic novel is also an awkward descriptive term for this thing that we do. First, because if you say graphic novel, people might assume you're talking about 50 Shades of Grey. And second, because many things that are called graphic novels are not actually novels. In Japanese, they're called manga, which is a word that means something like aimless or whimsical drawings, which is also the word that Hokusai used to describe his own sketchbooks. In French, they're called bande dessinée, or drawn strips. In Italian, one says fumetti, little puffs that refer to the word balloons or the thought balloons that float above the characters' heads. In Portuguese, quadrinhos, to mean the little squares in which the drawings appear on the page. In English, we're stuck with the word comics. But let's just let it mean all these drawn narrative things, whether they're intended to be comical or not. So let's do a quick little history. Comics as we know them began as a device for boosting the circulation of newspapers in the late 1800s. And it worked. They were an instant hit. And they were so popular that after a while, the strips that had already appeared in newspapers were then collected into booklets and sold in order to make more money from them. And when it was evident that those were a big hit, there seemed to be a void for new comics to fill. And so a lot of small publishers sprang up and began hiring hordes of aspiring comic strip artists and writers, basically anybody who could hold a pen, to churn out as many pages as they could on a regular schedule. And that's where the new comic books were born, although I have to say not all of the work produced in that period was top-notch. But whether they were in newspapers or in the new format called the comic book, the cartoonists were required to produce work to a monthly or a weekly or even a daily deadline. So the idea of the periodical aspect of comics was pretty much baked in from their inception. But despite that, or maybe because of it, because of the regimented mechanism for making comics in this way, we still can find a lot of invention and a high degree of craft in a lot of these works. And in a way, it's kind of like the way that certain authors or filmmakers have developed innovative uses of language or cinematic technique while working within popular genres. Eventually, decades down the road, new kind of comics would emerge that were not shackled to the demands of a publisher's schedule, but were created more out of the unrestricted vision of the creator, of the cartoonist. One thing that all comics have in common, whether they're children's comics, adult comics, adventure stories, history, memoir, is their narrative function. Even nonsensical comics, or more recent abstract comics, can only exist because they play off of the narrative nature of comics that's inherent to the form. And like any storytelling form, comics has its own intrinsic properties that make it unique. Many of these properties are so intuitively grasped that they seem to be self-evident. Since we're in a school, though, I feel it's incumbent on me to explain things that are self-evident. If you ask a lot of people how comics are made, their response is probably going to be, I didn't know people actually made them, which is what people used to say to me years ago when I told them what I did for a living. Their second response might be, I suppose somebody writes a script, and then that person or someone else draws the pictures that are described in the script. And while that's a basic description of how a lot of comics are made, it really vastly understates what can potentially happen on the page when the language of comics is being used most fluently. And here's why. Because everything in a comic is visual. Nothing happens on the page randomly or by accident. It's not like, say, a prose novel, where if a sentence doesn't fit at the bottom of a page, it just continues up at the top of the next page. Comics don't work that way. A cartoonist is responsible for every square inch of a page. So every decision that's made about drawing, about composition, about the arrangement of panels, the color, the use of words, the way words and images interact, even the paper, the size, the binding, everything about it can communicate something. And it's interesting to take advantage of all these properties. I should probably add, for those of you who live in the 21st century, the electronic platform on which you read your comics. Although I don't think paper is going away anytime soon. So what I'd like to do is walk you through many of the components and the aspects of this language, as I call it, that makes it work. We'll start with the panel. This is sort of our basic building block of comics. There are many comics, of course, that are made using a single panel, and that's it. And those are not the comics I'm talking about tonight. I'm talking about story comics, in which you have a series of panels over a page, or perhaps several, or even a lot of pages. So what is this thing, this panel? What does it do? What's its function? What does it represent? The most basic way to think about it, although not the only way, is that this panel can represent a moment in time. And let's look at an example. This is a Little Nemo in Slumberland comic from early in the 1900s by Winsor McCay. And the action is very simple to follow because he's kept the point of view very consistent. We're always looking at the side of Nemo's bed. As Nemo is dreaming that his bed is growing longer legs and coming alive and going for a walk, we follow from panel to panel, and this is a great example of what I mean, that each panel is very clearly a moment in time, one moment to the next, as we follow the bed, walking out the door and from the suburbs into an area of row houses and into the downtown, and as it gets taller, climbing onto the buildings where it eventually trips and stumbles, depositing Nemo back on the floor from which he's fallen out of his bed, of course, waking up from his dream. What's really nice about the way McCay designed this, too, is as the panels get taller to accommodate the height of the bed, and then to show the linear perspective on the buildings so we can see how high they are, he designs it so that he leaves room for the last panel to be the same size as the first panel, getting back to where we started. This is a page from my book, Asterios Polyp, and if you look across the top row of panels, this is another use of this panel as a moment in time. This works really well for showing how something works. In this case, the function of a corkscrew. But comics don't always have to be so rigidly fixed to one point of view, however. Most comics are done more like this. This is another page from a comic I made about 20 years ago. Well, each panel is a moment in time, and each succeeding panel is some time after that, some short amount of time after that. But by focusing on details and using different compositions and different angles, the cartoonist is also able to give you more a sense of the total scene and the atmosphere of what's going on. There's also the amount of time that takes place between each panel, which can be very short or very long. I wish I could tell you who made this. Somebody faxed this to me a long time ago. Now, not only can this use of the panel as a time unit go forward, but in this page from Asterios Polyp, I'm using the three panels actually to go backward, where the top is Asterios in grad school, the middle one is him in college, and the bottom in high school. So following his life all the way back to the beginning. And not only, it doesn't have to go forward in time, it doesn't even have to go backward in time. This is a page of comics by Gilbert Hernandez. This is one page from a longer story that takes place in this fictional village in South America that many of his stories take place in. And we're seeing panels that show different characters who live in that village doing different things. In this case, in this context, what he's trying to show us is not that time is going forward or backward, but that we're looking at a number of different things that are happening at more or less the same time. Another way of sort of contracting time is this four-panel sequence at the top of another one of my pages, where what we're looking at are four different characters in four different times doing the same thing. And so I've designed it using the same composition and splitting the sentence that all of them would be saying into four different balloons across the panels so that it reinforces the similarity of these four events and joins them together in that way. Another interesting use of a panel that can represent time in some way. At the bottom of this page, what we're looking at is not four separate events, but in this context, we're looking at one event that's being remembered four different ways, which is why there are slight variations in the drawing. There's another sequence in my book where I was dealing with depicting memory. In this case, Asterios is remembering times past, and across the center of the page, there's a strip that actually is a story told in the usual chronological way that we read comics, but above and below are a number of panels that seem to be random images. But what I was trying to do here was to use each image as a kind of a spark, either because of what it showed or the idea behind it, to the next image, and that as a spark to the next image, trying to represent the way I think memory actually does work. This is an early Fantastic Four comic by drawn by Jack Kirby, and the top of the page shows the story progressing along as usual. In the middle, we see the Fantastic Four flying back to their headquarters building. They land on the roof, and as they're going into the building, the next panel we see takes us for an instant out of the temporal flow of time in this comic to show us a diagram of the building that they're in, which is important information for us to know. And we know it's important because there's a caption on it that says, "Save this for future reference." And it's another way that the panel can be used to offer information to the reader. Now back to my book, in this scene, Asterios is talking about his childhood, and the images in the center tier are not showing scenes from his childhood that relate to what he's saying, but they're more iconic representations of his experience during the time he's talking about. So they become more symbolic images. Again, not necessarily tied to time in the way that we were looking at time moving forward or backward. But let's get back to that idea of time moving forward or backward. In this case, moving forward. If we still look at panels as moments, here's another Nemo story, as comic. And we look at the bottom of the page, there are three big panels. And the first one, we see Nemo and his friends at one point on a stairwell. In the second panel, we see the same four characters at a different point, and the last, we see them up higher. And each of those is a moment in time, but by drawing it the way he did and linking those three panels together to make the one big scene, it is a great way of showing us a movement through a space, which is not that dissimilar from things that we would see looking at old photographs by Edward Muybridge when he was doing photographs to discover how people and animals moved by setting up a string of cameras and having them timed to go off as somebody was performing some kind of action. So in this case, very much like comic book panels, we see this man's jump. We see the trajectory of the jump, and the background is continuous throughout as we see him moving through the space. If we go back even further into art history, this is a fresco by Mazzucchelli, The Tribute Money. And we can see that in telling this Bible story, Mazzucchelli has set up a space in which the action is going to play out. In the center, we have Jesus and his merry men, and they're being confronted by a tax collector who's saying, "Where's my money?" Jesus is pointing to the left, directing Peter to go over to the river. And we see Peter also pointing, "You mean over there?" And if we follow Peter's finger, we can see another representation of Peter kneeling down by the river and taking a coin from the mouth of a fish. And then we have to go all the way over to the right to see him handing that coin to the tax collector, who is conveniently now also depicted on the right of the painting as well. If we look at this Hey Look comic by Harvey Kurtzman from about 1950, look at the bottom panel in this one. It's about the same shape as the Mazzucchelli painting. And you can see that there's a dotted line depicted on what would be the ground that curls around, seems to stop at a lamppost and curl around again up to the feet of the character who's walking and perhaps about to step into a manhole, I can't tell. But that dotted line is showing the progression of this guy walking after he's been blinded by shining somebody's shoes a little too brightly. And here's a panel that it's not showing us clipped moments of the guy walking and bumping and continuing to walk. The dotted line gives us the whole path that he took to get from one side of the panel to the other side of the panel. And what this teaches us, of course, is that if Mazzucchelli had used a dotted line for Peter, it would have been a much better painting. Here's a Steve Ditko Spider-Man page from the early 1960s. We look in the center of the page. This panel, much like St. Peter, Spider-Man appears to be in 3 places at the same time. But we know he can't be, because that would be unrealistic. So what, of course, is happening here is that we're seeing the figure of Spider-Man bouncing around and taking out these 3 thugs. And of course, this could be shown in 3 separate panels. But the artist is more interested in showing the flow of the whole action rather than just the 3 impacts. And by doing this, it also compresses the time, in a sense, that by having it all in one picture, it re-emphasizes or reinforces the speed with which this is taking place, because we tend to think of a panel as showing us just one time. Again, in painting, people have tried to deal with how do you show movement through time, through space, like this Duchamp painting, and another painting done at the same time by Giacomo Balla, which seems to be influenced by stop-motion photography to me. Here's a Calvin and Hobbes strip by Bill Watterson. In the 3rd tier, where they're racing, in here, you can see that as they start moving faster, these lines appear of their trails. We call those speed lines in comics that show where they've been and the direction in which they're going. In the 3rd panel in that tier, you can see they're moving so fast that they've become out of focus and blurry as they're zipping past us. And this is a very common way of showing movement in comics. Interestingly, in Japan, the cartoonists there have developed a slightly different take on that. Here's a character who's jogging and then starts running faster from an example that I took from a How to Draw Manga magazine published in Japan that shows that when the character starts running faster, it's not the figure who becomes blurry and out of focus, it's the background. And so that sets up an interesting change. In the previous example, the viewer is fixed at a location and watching things zip by. In this example, the viewer is more connected to the character and moving with the character and watching the world zip by. So you can have more of a subjective point of view as the reader, and you can create that as the cartoonist. Here's just a couple more examples. This is from Western comic drawn by Jack Kirby. In the 2 panels in the center of the page, we can also see examples of how a panel is not just a snapshot of a single moment. Where the cowboy is shooting the supports for the chandelier and it's falling on the bad guys. In the drawing, technically, the chandelier is already down, but somehow our brain registers that this is a cause and effect action, even in that one image. And in the next one, of course, you can also see that his gun, despite the word pow only twice, the drawing tells us that gun's going off at least 4 times, and the results can be seen in his opponent's gun and hat and scarf and belt flying off in different directions. This is a page from a Tintin comic by Hergé. Hergé wants to show an extended period of time, and he does it by combining a single image of Tintin sitting and waiting, he's being told to wait for somebody, with a series of clocks above him that show how much time is passing, during which we're led to believe Tintin hasn't really moved from that position. Another way of doing that, this is from a Daredevil comic from about 1980, drawn by Frank Miller. And the bottom 2 tiers, here, we also see another clock, as these characters are waiting. And it's 3 panels, but it's all one scene, as we can see. But by dividing it up, we're focusing on different aspects, and it slows the time down. And they're waiting for this guy. And you can see that there's 4 panels of him with almost no change to the drawings before he suddenly has something to say and stands up. So comics is also capable of not only cutting up actions into little pieces, but also compressing time and expanding the time. Now, in the top of the 2 tiers I was pointing to, the clock is ticking, tick, 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 tick. Her watch is ticking, click, 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 click. And the judge is tapping his fingers as well. Those words also give us an indication of how much time is supposed to be passing in this drawing. Here's a page from a Will Eisner Spirit comic from the 1940s. And in the top row, we can see this character here is anxiously waiting for something. A lot of anxiety in these comics. And so he's pulling out a cigarette. It's the 1940s. So as we focus on him with the matches in his hand, we see this panel of him starting to light the match. There's one drawing of him scraping the match across the side of the box, but the word scratch appears 3 times. Rather than draw that 3 times, the artist is letting the words do part of the work so that it's a more efficient use of the image and the words together. In the next panel, you see there's no drawing at all, just the words scratch. And he designs it in such a way that we pull away from the character's face before it's melodramatically illuminated by the lit match at the end. Now, words in comics are not just for marking off how much time is passing, and there are a lot of words in comics that are dialogue and narration. This is from a Chester Gould, Dick Tracy comic. And the tradition in American comics is to make lettering like this hand lettering that's all uppercase letters in a block letter. It's just the way it's been done for many, many years. Then you notice that some words are in bold and larger, and we understand that as the reader, that those words are emphasized or spoken at a louder volume. We also see in the second panel that the balloon has a jagged outline, and it's coming from Dick Tracy's 2-way wrist radio. Boy, don't we wish we had those. So the jagged line is indicating some kind of more staticky or electronic voice that's coming out of there. So not only the words themselves and the way they're drawn, but the shape of the balloon can indicate something about what's being said, as can be seen in this comic as well. I think that icy word balloon pretty much says everything you need to know about how this teenage girl is feeling toward her boyfriend right now. So a few daily strips of Pogo, which is a newspaper strip by Walt Kelly. If we look in the middle of the page here, I don't know if you can see that the lettering is pretty much what I described, the simple uppercase letters that all the characters in the story, in the comic strip, seem to be using to speak, except for this guy at the top. We have a character here who's dressed in a more old-fashioned garb. He's got pince-nez on his nose. He's holding a big sheaf of legal-looking papers, and you can see something from his lettering, if you can make it out in here. Maybe you can't. But his lettering is drawn in a more Old English style font. And the shape of his word balloons, unlike all these, is more like chipped parchment. So even without reading the words that he's saying, we know from just the visual information that there's something different about the way this guy is speaking and about the kind of words maybe that he's using as well. Back to this Tintin book, Hergé does a very interesting thing in this panel. Tintin has been told, this story takes place in China, and Tintin has been told that he has to go to a street called Taiping Lu. So when he goes out, he meets this policeman. And Tintin says the words, Taiping Lu, and the policeman responds all in Chinese characters. And without any narration to tell us this, with only the visual information, Hergé is letting us understand that 2 people in this panel are speaking Chinese words, but one of them is a native speaker and the other one is not. This is a page from that City of Glass book that Julia mentioned. There's a character in the book who is a grown man but is somewhat childlike, and he speaks in a very strange way. And so when I did the lettering on him, I made it essentially the uppercase letters that we were talking about, but I inserted about 7 letters that were always lowercase, but drawn at the same height as the uppercase letters, so that when you start reading his dialogue, you may not initially notice that there's anything odd about it, but over time, the hope is that you'll start to realize that it's not quite right. And I took this further in my book, Asterios Polyp, by giving every character in the book his or her own unique lettering style, as well as word balloon shape or style. As you can see on this page, there are 4 different characters, each speaking in a different style of writing. This, if you recognize that that's what is going on in a comic, it makes it easier to indicate who's speaking if that character happens to be off panel. Putting words together with images in comics is basically graphic design. And we have a long history of putting words and pictures together in something like poster design. This is a Bonnard poster that obviously he made the drawing and made the hand-drawn letters with the same brush or the same tools, so that it really, the lettering and the drawing become part of the total design as one. And here's a couple more Will Eisner spirit splash pages to show how he's used elements of the drawing to bring the title of the spirit stories in, and that in a way that relates to what the content of the story is going to be as well. This is a Chris Ware page from his book, Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Kid on Earth. And the first panel tells us, Chicago of today, the metropolis of the West. And what today is Chris Ware talking about? Well, we know from the style of the lettering, as well as the way the drawing is made, that the today he's talking about is an Art Nouveau today. So that sets us in a particular time. And he reinforces that as the page continues by the way he uses the narration. In most comics, if there's narration, it's attached to the picture in a single panel. In this instance, he's alternating a panel of narration with a panel that has an image, back and forth. And the way the narration is written, the white letters on the black ground, has a very specific connotation. It really feels like the way early silent movies were shown, with action taking place, and then you'd see a title card come up, and you had to read a little bit, and then you watched the action again. So all of the decisions he's making about the design on this page really plant us in a certain period in the early 20th century. Now, this is all about the design of what happens with the way the lettering is done and what that tells you. But the comics themselves, of course, are drawn in different styles. But we have to think about, what do comics look like? Well, most people think comics look like this. Certainly most advertising art directors think that comics look like this. And some comics do look like this, and comics have looked like this. But comics started off looking a little bit more like this Mutt and Jeff comic by Bud Fisher, or this Flash Gordon comic by Alex Raymond. The two of those are quite different. Or comics might look like this Carl Barks Donald Duck, or like this H.G. Peters drawing of Wonder Woman. The styles of comics can really range widely. This is a page by Jose Munoz, a page by Seiichi Hayashi, a page by Gary Panter, Jaime Hernandez, Jillian Tamaki, and an artist who goes by his initials CF. All taking the look of comics in different directions, and all for different expressive purposes. Here's a page from a comic I made about a dozen years ago that retells an ancient Japanese tale. And in order to evoke that period, I wanted to design it to be reminiscent of Edo period Japanese woodblock prints. But the simplest way of thinking about how style can work in comics is, if you have a funny story to tell, draw it in a funny style, like this Brazilian cartoonist Adão Ituruskarai. If you have a horrific story to tell, draw it in a horrific style, like this comic by Hideshi Hino. What gets a little bit more interesting is when you take something like this page by Julie Doucet, where her drawing style appears to be very lighthearted. But if you look at the actions that are taking place on this page, she's actually got a broken beer bottle and she's slicing open the throat of her roommate. And it gets pretty bloody in the third panel here. So the style of presentation and what's happening in the story now are at odds with each other in a way, and it creates a friction that can make the reading experience a little bit more interesting and maybe a little more disturbing. Here's a Calvin and Hobbes comic by Bill Watterson, and he does something very interesting. Calvin is afraid that there are monsters under the bed. His father assures him that there are not, but he doesn't believe him, so when he's in the dark, he starts making a lot of noise to scare the monsters away. Of course, then a monster comes bursting through the door, saying, "What's all this noise?" It is not, of course, a monster. It's Calvin's dad. But by drawing it this way, Watterson is putting us inside Calvin's head. He's not saying, then Calvin thought he saw a monster when his father came through the door. He's making it very immediate by drawing it in a way that Calvin would be experiencing it. So getting back to that idea of the subjective way of showing something again. Here's a page by a French comics artist named Yvan Alagbe, and he's doing something very similar. This is from a much longer story, but in this case, a father and a son are having a very heated argument. And in the last panel, as the son storms off, he's not here manifesting his newly found mutant powers. He's actually in a rage, and the artist uses a stylistic shift in order to express that. Robert Crumb, in 1989, I see here on the page, did a short adaptation of part of Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea. He gives it a very Mad Magazine-like treatment for the title. As we get into the story, though, you see that he's doing things that aren't usual for his comics, which tend to be very orderly. In this case, in order to evoke this sense of existential vertigo, the panels seem to be sliding off the page. The lettering, even, is cramped and claustrophobic. And the drawing here, I mean, this guy, all these people couldn't possibly fit in this space. When he gets up to leave the restaurant, notice that these tables all seem like they're sitting on different planes of the floor. And even when he leaves and seems to be feeling better, according to himself, we look at the windows and the doorways and the street around him, and they're still somewhat distorted, and we get the sense that, no, that sense of that feeling he was having has not left him yet. He's still carrying it with him. In my book, I tried to do something along those lines. One of the themes that comes up is this idea that each individual has a unique experience of the world. And I tried to express that by drawing different characters in completely different styles in different parts of the book. And when I was developing this in the book, it sounded like a familiar idea to me. And I realized it was, because Saul Steinberg had done several drawings along this same idea. In my book, I tried to take that idea and play it out more along narrative lines. For example, in this scene, the beginning of the top of the first page, you can see the way that's drawn is the way most of the book is drawn. But this woman, in the middle of the page, her perception of reality comes through, and which is why this is drawn in her style right here. And then what we see at the bottom of the page is Asterios undergoing a transformation as he is being drawn into her reality, which is then what we see on the next page. So that the styles are individual when they're individual, but sometimes they can kind of shift. And I show this again in a scene at a party. This is a faculty party. These are all the faculty, drawn in their various ways. And these two characters are going to meet. We see them meeting here, and over these three panels, as they meet and begin to talk to each other and get to know each other, we see that their two styles are starting to merge and become one that they share. This also works because of the color that I've used. Color in comics has, for the most part, been not dissimilar to what's happening on this Little Lulu page by John Stanley. The color is essentially or primarily there to distinguish one thing from another thing. Here's an old page I did of Daredevil comic. This is the original art in black and white. This was drawn knowing that there was going to be color added. So when you use tall, thin panels like this, it can get to be difficult to read what's happening on a page like this in black and white. But when you see the color added, it makes a lot more sense. Color can go in many different directions depending on what it is you're trying to establish or what kind of mood or tone you're trying to present as well. This is a panel by Alex Toth, an American artist, in black and white that I took and colored a few different ways just to show the decisions that can be made from the naturalistic to more symbolic or graphic. And we notice on this Spider-Man page that Spider-Man is underwater. We know he's underwater because he's solid blue. And this works very effectively, I think. It comes about because of how comics were produced for years as cheaply as they possibly could be made. So there was no time to do elaborate coloring, and there was no money to do color separations of any kind of subtlety. So you just make the character solid blue and we know he's underwater. But it works really well. And even an artist like the French artist Mobius, when he has a chance to hand paint the color and choose any color he wants, realizes that this is a pretty interesting graphic trick to use sometimes, to knock things out in one color or in a family of colors, to group items or figures together, either to show a spatial relationship or some other kind of relationship, like in the bottom panel, where these four figures are all colored in the same orange, to distinguish them from the background, but also to show that they are somehow connected. The artist Jacques Tardy usually works in black and white, but in this particular story about an exterminator, the exterminator is always shown in this red jumpsuit, which acts to put a spotlight on him. It also acts to isolate him. And because this was done in the 1970s, I have a feeling that it may also be a subtle parody of superhero costumes in American comics. And I think Steven Spielberg used this trick in one of his movies. The artist Brecht Evans, in his recent book, The Wrong Place, does something almost the opposite. He creates a world that's very colorful, where all the characters are in different colors, except for this one guy almost in the center of all the panels, who's always painted in gray, which says something about his personality and how the other characters perceive him. And in a nice little bit of wordplay, the gray character is named Gary. Here's a another page of Daredevil from 1980 from Frank Miller. And Frank Miller, working with the colorist Glenn Whelan, does something with the color in this page that's akin to background music. In the center tier of panels, there's a character in the background who is about to try to do something uncharacteristic. And as he gets to the point where he has to decide whether to do it or not, the color gets much hotter. And then he decides he can't do it. And we see the color cool down again. And then things get dangerous, and that's a good thing that Daredevil shows up at the bottom of the page. But that's another use of a color for some kind of emotional purpose. In my book, as I said, I was using color to show the different styles coming together, but also I used limited palettes in my book for some very simple reasons. In this case, one palette to show scenes that take place in the present, as opposed to a different palette to show scenes that take place in the past. And also using color to subtly and sometimes not so subtly show different stages of relationship between characters. Now this is the toolbox that cartoonists have to work with. How do we put it all together? As I said, there's that page that needs to be designed. And that can be a very interesting thing, because that page, once you divide it up into panels, you have a structure. Let's look at this Nancy comic by Ernie Bushmiller. She's hiding a box of candy in the first panel so that she won't eat it all. And then she does things to try to get it out of her mind and forget where she put the box. This is one of my favorite panels in the history of comics right here, as she's trying to forget where the candy box is. Of course, at the end, no, she can't fool anybody as smart as her, so she goes back and finds where it is. And what is happening here is a very classic storytelling device of ending where you begin. It works particularly well in something like comics because you have a very clear visual sense that the beginning of the story and the end of the story are the same. It's reinforced right in front of your eyes. Here's another one. Nancy's eating at the top of the page. She looks happy. In the second tier, a voice starts coming in saying, don't put your elbows on the table. Stop dropping crumbs on the floor. Don't chew so fast. You've got too much food in your mouth. Don't eat with your mouth open. Stop gulping your milk. Use your napkin. Finally, Nancy speaks up and says, please do me a favor. Stop making me feel so much at home. Now, the way this works, and this is a really nice example of how the page can be divided up to create a rhythm. Each tier has more panels than the previous one. It starts with 2, then 3, then 4. And looking at the size of that please do me a favor panel, you get the sense that there would be 5 panels in that last tier if she didn't interrupt. And then we have a large panel that shows us the room that the action is actually taking place in. So the criticisms are speeding up with each successive tier. Here's a comic from 1952 from the second issue of Mad, which began as a comic book before it became a magazine. And this is written and laid out by Harvey Kurtzman with artwork by Will Elder. And it's called Mole, which is the name of our antagonist. This is the character who's digging through the ground here. And I want you to see what happens once we get to the two-page spread, when you turn the page. At the top, we see Mole digging his way to a place, 3 panels, and then he comes up. He sees that he's surrounded by police. He tries to shoot his way out. The next page shows him being kicked into a prison cell, patung. The warden speaking to him about how they knew he'd be caught, talking to him for 3 panels, and then taking away his food in this case, but leaving behind the spoon. Clang, as the door slams shut. Let's see what happens on the next 2 pages. 2 panels of him digging, 3-panel sequence where he comes up into the call box. He realizes he's surrounded by police. He tries to shoot his way out. Here he is being kicked into a prison cell, patung. Only they've taken away his clothes this time, put him in solitary confinement. The warden talks to him, speaks for 3 panels, and as he leaves, he drops something, the toothpick, as the door slams shut, clong. That should look familiar. We go to the next page, and once again, we see him digging out for the top 2 panels, going someplace and about to come up. He's at the policeman's ball, surrounded by cops, tries to shoot his way out. Patung. This time they've taken all his clothes, all his hair, but unfortunately they left a nostril hair in his nose, which he then digs his way out again. But the story ends on this page where he goes to the place that is the last place he wanted to get to. What's fascinating about this is that Kurtzman has used the structure of the page to organize his information. He knew he had 7 pages to work with. I don't know how he came up with the story, whether it was the structure first or the idea, but once he sort of designed the layout, he realized that he could use repetition in a way that built the information so that we recognize something we'd seen before with a slight variation. And it built in this idea of this routine of this guy who was going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again until the end. I used a similar device in my book, Asterios Polyp, when I'm recounting briefly the life of this female character at the top right of the first page, and showing a history of her family and when she was born, and then her childhood. And then when you turn the page, you get the same layout again that shows her in college and then afterwards. And I'm using that same structure and plugging in the bits of information that I want in ways that you can see a relationship between what happened earlier in her life and later in her life. There are also words in comics. In this case, a lot of words. This is a page from a Classics Illustrated adaptation of Hamlet. This is really good writing, but this is not really good comics. A lot of people, again, may have the idea that if you have really good writing and really good drawing, you've got really good comics. Even if this drawing were the best drawing you ever saw, this is not necessarily the best, most effective use of the language of comics. It's much better, generally, if you have some kind of interaction going on between the words and the pictures, because those words are a visual aspect of the page. If you have it all in a block in the corner, you might as well just have a printed text with a little illustration to one side. So here's a page from Batman #1 by Bob Kane, and probably with text by Bill Finger. And I'll read you the caption on this panel with the car in the middle. It says, "As the car careens madly off the bridge, the door swings open. The Batman's tumbling form takes the Joker with it." And the drawing shows us the car careening madly off the bridge, the door swinging open, and the Batman's tumbling form taking the Joker with it. The next panel reads, "The struggling men fall to the bridge. As they rise, the Joker explodes a haymaker off the Batman's jaw." And the drawing shows us the Joker exploding a haymaker off the Batman's jaw. The next panel says, "A wicked kick rakes the Batman's head." And sure enough, there's a drawing of a wicked kick raking the Batman's head. This is not necessarily the most effective use of narration when the pictures are showing you exactly what the narration is saying. There is one panel in this page that does something differently and much better. The first panel, we see Batman hanging on to this car that's speeding toward us, which is a dangerous position. The caption says, "Only the mighty Batman could have made the leap successfully." Well, that tells me something that the picture is not telling me, and that the picture can't tell me. The only way I would know that visually is if perhaps there were a series of panels showing me a bunch of other people trying to successfully make that leap and failing, and then one of Batman doing it successfully. But that takes up a lot of space. Much more efficient to have a caption like this one that tells me something that I can't see, and then showing me a picture of something that I can see. Here's 2 pages from a Dan Klaus comic where he's using this in the way that I'm talking about. The images show a character who's standing away from a building, watching the building, waiting for someone, and when that person comes out, following her. And we can see all that very clearly in the drawings. There's narration at the top of each panel, but it's not talking about what's going on there. It's first-person narration of the character's thoughts. And his thoughts happen to be about something else. So we're getting what's going on in his head while he's standing there and watching and then walking away. And that's a great thing because it gives us 2 different levels of information simultaneously, which, as I said, is a much more efficient and more effective way of bringing words and pictures together in comics. Probably the example that I've seen where the words and the pictures have been pushed farthest apart is from a Chris Ware comic called I Guess. This comic is drawn in such a way that if you follow just the pictures, there is a very clear superhero story being told in the style of a comic from the 1940s. When you read the text, though, it's a first-person memoir by Chris about his childhood. And in fact, it runs right through caption boxes and dialogue balloons and sound effects. All are words of this reminiscence. At first, you wonder, why has he put these 2 things together? But as you get about 3 or 4 pages in, he says things about reading comics, about the heroes that he admired, that start to make you understand why he may have put these 2 completely different seeming stories together. And they start to interact in very interesting ways. Another artist, cartoonist, who uses the combination of words and images very effectively is Ben Ketcher, who for years had this strip appearing weekly in free newspapers called Julius Knipple, Real Estate Photographer. That's Julius Knipple there in the second panel. And what Ben does, in the narration, he'll give a kind of a musing about an idea, a kind of an abstract idea. Then the pictures and the dialogue will show actions taking place between characters. By themselves, the images with the dialogue and the narration are okay, but they don't tell you the whole story. It's only when the 2 are put together and they add to each other that you get the whole idea of the comic that he's trying to portray. Comics have always been self-reflexive as well. People who make comics make drawings, and they know that they're not drawing real objects and people, that these were just lines that represent these things. We go all the way back to Little Nemo to see that back from the beginning, people have known that. In this case, as Nemo is with his friends in Slumberland and they walk by a landscape, the landscape starts changing and looking like very crudely done drawings of a horse and buggy, a man walking by, and then the dog changes. And then his companions start looking like bad drawings. And Nemo gets scared and runs home, and this is what his house looks like. And he gets there, and his mother is starting to look like a bad drawing. And she starts getting even worse looking here. And then Dad shows up, and the cat. And Nemo is very scared, and then he starts turning into one of these bad drawings as well. And this penultimate panel is one of the scariest panels I've ever read in a comic book, where Nemo is absolutely in agony of what he and his parents have turned into. Fortunately, he wakes up as a very good-looking drawing. Here's a Crazy Cat comic by George Harriman, where he also seems to be commenting on the nature of the relationship between depiction and reality, where here we have Ignaz the mouse making a drawing in the air of himself, and then Officer Pup comes along, and he's still drawing, and he draws a brick next to him, and he draws Crazy Cat, and then as Ignaz himself turns to look at Officer Pup, the drawing of Ignaz the mouse bends down, grabs the brick, and beans Crazy with it, which is, of course, what Ignaz wants to do in real life. The last panel shows that, in fact, happening, and this time, Officer Pup is making a drawing in the air of what the outcome of this will be. Frank King, the creator of Gasoline Alley, did a number of really interesting things in his Sunday strips. In this case, two of the main characters are in an art museum, and they're looking at modern painting. And they don't quite understand it, so they step into the painting and so decide to walk around. And that's what we see over the course of these 9 panels as they're exploring this more abstracted reality. This is from about 1925 or so. Here's an interesting sequence from a longer comic by an artist named Kamagurka. And it also shows that what you see isn't necessarily what you think you see when it comes to line drawings. Toward the middle of this comic, you can see the numbers on the panels there? Number 39, he's turning the ship and it turns too much and he turns it back. And by 42, you can see that there's a breach in the hull. So by number 43, he runs down, and 44, he sees the water pouring through. Look at number 45, how he solves this problem. He gets a saw out and cuts the water off. So in 46 now, he's carrying this heavy thing away, and we see the stump of what we thought was water coming through the ship. He carries it for another panel, sets it up on the deck, and then I love what happens in the last panel. Completely nonsensically chops it down. Another early comic strip from 1904 was this Upside Down strip, and this gets into how we read the comics as well. There are 2 characters in these Upside Down comics by Verbike, and they were designed so that when you see them one way, it's the male figure, but if you turn it upside down, it's the female figure. And he designs the panels in such a way that you read these 6 panels and you get half the story. And then you turn it upside down and you read the same panels back to the beginning again and you get the second half of the story. And here's an artist named Jim Steranko who did a comic about a super spy for Marvel in the 1960s. And he's doing something kind of similar. This character has to make it through some kind of labyrinth. And so he designs the page with these maze components so that you follow from one panel to the next by going through the maze. When you get to the bottom of the page, you actually have to turn the page sideways and then upside down to get to the middle as it spirals in, and we're following the progression of the character. Chris Ware, yet again, has done a lot of experimenting and exploration about how to read a comic page. In this case, he's got us reading forwards, backwards, down, across, and even superimposing letters on top of other letters so that sometimes a sentence can have more than one meaning depending on which word you read. And this is a page from a comic strip by Richard McGuire called Here, in which we're actually reading through time. Every panel in this comic depicts the same location from the same angle. But what he does is he shows it to us at various times. You see 1940, 1999, 1975, 1920, and he even subdivides the panel into smaller amounts so that you're seeing a portion of that area. In this case, it's a room. In other pages, we see it before the house was even there, or after the house has burned down, or in various stages of different holidays, different decorations, different people. The last panel, we can see a bunch of women sitting around, but we also see these 3 panels that say 1860 that have a donkey and cows, showing that in 1860 it was just a field, and in 1944 it was this living room. This is, I said quick, it was probably not as quick as you expected, a quick idea of the potential for comics by people who have really been so interested that they've explored all these different ways of taking a medium that was essentially designed to tell simple stories. But the more people have used it and delved into it, the more they've found that these seemingly simple techniques can actually be used for much more complex purposes. Now, there's a common perception about people who are into comics, a stereotype, if you will. This is a 1968 comic from DC that only lasted for 2 issues. But it seems to me that if you want to be good at anything, if you want to be really good at anything, you have to be kind of a geek. I'm sure that great authors are geeks for literature, and great musicians are geeks for music, and great designers are geeks for fashion, and great painters are geeks for painting. And not just in the arts. If I have to have surgery, I want my doctor to really be into surgery, not just be kind of casual about it. It's that immersion and that real interest in something that I think drives people to want to get better at what they do and keep going forward. Now for me, I'm going to very quickly end this by talking about myself a little bit. When I started making comics, and yes, it was a long time ago, I learned how to make comics by just looking at the comics that were around me, that I read, that I liked, and trying to figure out how are they made. And because I was always as interested in writing as I was in drawing, and I wanted to make stories, it wasn't just about trying to look at my favorite artists and copy their technique, but also why did they use 2 panels instead of 3? Why did they use this composition? How do they tell this particular kind of sequence in a way that's effective? And always trying to look at what I was, as I said, my favorite stuff, the stuff I thought worked best, and duplicate it in some way. When I went to art school, I did not study comics. At the time I was in school, there was no program for studying comics, probably in just about every art school, with a couple of exceptions. And I don't really mind that, because actually I think having a broader education really helped me out rather than focusing so much on comics, which I was already doing anyway. But what I did was the usual kind of art school stuff. And perhaps because I was so interested in comics, I really focused on the figure when I was in school. Or maybe because I liked drawing the figure so much, that was why I was interested in comics. It's a kind of a chicken and egg thing, and I don't really know. But I'm just showing you the kind of drawings I was doing in my time in art school, typical student stuff, fast drawings, slow drawings. And I achieved a pretty good level of proficiency in drawing from life, as you can see from these drawings from the various years that I was there. But I was still interested in comics on my own. And in between school years, in the summers, I would try to make some sample pages. Now, at the same time, I was doing drawings that looked like this. Well, I was also thinking about not just the figure, but spaces, because characters, people exist in spaces as well. What do these spaces look like? What are buildings? How are they really structured? How are they built? What do they look like from different angles? Specifically, what do the rooftops look like? Here's one of the pages I did while I was in college. It's hard for me to look at this now and say the same guy who was doing those figure drawings did this page. These buildings and these characters don't have the same credibility as the drawings I was just showing you a minute ago. And here's another one. The figures are kind of stiff, they're awkward looking, the spaces are not necessarily convincing. Here's one that's maybe a little bit better, but you notice there's no backgrounds to speak of. And because I wanted to know if I could actually do this stuff, I took a bunch of these pages and I sent them to Marvel Comics, back in the day when you could do that kind of thing. Publishers won't accept unsolicited submissions anymore. Back then you could send them to somebody and you might get an answer. I sent them to the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, and I got an answer. And I would like to read you what this letter says. It says, "Dear David, your samples are pretty good, but not quite up to standard yet. I wish I had time to give you a detailed critique," he has an accent over the E there, "but I don't. For one thing, you need work on anatomy. I see lots of big-headed, too skinny, and too dumpy characters here. Our priorities are 1, storytelling, clear, readable, dramatic, straightforward, letting the reader know what's going on at a glance. 2, good drawing, including anatomy, perspective, and composition. Tied for second are 2, dynamics, and 2, drama. Weird-shaped panels, obscure pictures, and dull-looking characters are the kiss of death. Thank you. Don't get me wrong. No, I won't get you wrong. You seem to have quite a bit of talent. Your samples stood out quite a bit from the rest of the slush pile. You're not good enough yet, but you probably could be someday if you wanted to be. Now let me point out, if you've never gotten one of these, this is a good rejection letter. He's very specific about what the problems are, and he's encouraging. Most often, you'd get a letter that just says something, if you get a letter at all, you get a letter that says something like, thank you for your submission, we have no use for your work at this time. This actually told me what I needed to work on. So I didn't give up. I went back and made more samples. I drew over 100 pages over the next few years and kept trying to send them in. And finally, I did some pages that got me in the door. It was this, and a couple others. And they gave me one job to do. Unfortunately, the job I did was not as good as these samples because I was actually in a little over my head. But at least I met a few people by doing that job. And so I went back to the drawing board. I made more samples. And here, on these samples, you can start to see something of what I was learning from doing all those life drawings is creeping into these pages now. Because the key is that you can learn to draw from life very well, but making things up is a lot harder. And by drawing and drawing and drawing and looking and then trying to construct the things, eventually I got to a point where, yes, I'm starting to get the feeling of things and showing the people who I wanted to hire me what I could do. Not just have characters jumping through space, but also show I can draw buildings, interiors, exteriors, people in normal clothes, because I wanted to tell stories. I got into comics just wanting to start by drawing, but I knew eventually I'd want to write my own stories as well. And I ended up doing a few pages of this character called Daredevil, and then a few pages of a character called Batman, again, showing all the different things that I can draw. You can tell when I did this by the way that telephone looks. And when I did finally get work based on these samples and get regular work, it was interesting because I ended up professionally drawing Daredevil and Batman. So the samples must have steered me in the right direction. But after drawing superheroes for about 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years, I realized that as much as I loved making comics, these weren't the stories that I really wanted to be telling. After all those years as a kid reading that stuff, it was very nice to do this. But there were other things I wanted to do, and it took me a little while, but eventually I got away from that and started developing stories that were along different lines, and also playing around with the whole notion of drawing and exploring drawing again, and even the idea of using color but in very limited ways. In this case, here's a comic that I did that is really influenced by printmaking in that this is not a black line with added color. This is a whole story made up of 2 overlapping colors. And where you see the dark color that looks sort of like a grayish brown, that's just where the 2 colors overlap. So it was all about putting the 2 colors together to make a third. In this case, the original art, such as it were, doesn't look like this. It's all drawn in black ink. As far as I'm concerned, the printed book is the original, because that looks like what I intended. And rather than show you more stuff that came after this, you may have noticed that I cleverly included a lot of my work in the talk that I gave so that you could see some of the things that I did developing my work over the years in order to make it up to this book that I made that was published 3 years ago, which is the biggest, most ambitious thing that I did, and which I tried to take everything I know about comics and put it into this book. And I'm not sure if I did that, because even though I've been interested in comics and making comics since I was 6 and being paid for it for the last 30 years, there are still lots of things about this medium that are very interesting and that I'm still discovering, and that I see other artists still discovering, and that still, I feel like there's still a lot of room to grow and to take it in different directions. And so that's probably what I'm going to do. So Thank you very much.